Here we are, pleasant afternoon, winter, coming on to spring, the birds are singing. So why am I talking about fear stalking the land? Look, we don't live in Gaza or the Ukraine or Sudan where there are active wars going on. We don't have to dodge drones and bombs or face starvation as a people because of an extensive social security net. Obviously it has holes in it, but it does tend to keep body and soul together of the 1/3 of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive. So what type of fear am I talking about? Now, we live in a capitalist society, a private investment for private profit society, and in 2025, as I've been explaining over the last few months, what we've seen is the domination of the private sector over all aspects of human life, human existence, goods, services, the list goes on and on. So we are becoming more dependent on the private sector as what's left of the collective and cooperative sector dies out, and what's left of the public sector is handed over to the private sector. Now, the issue, when I say fear stalks the land, the central issue is insecurity. In Australia in 2025, the difference between living a reasonable life where you can pay your bills and hopefully have a little bit over for the better things in life is 6 weeks' wages. Now, although many people are involved in small business, most small businesses and micro businesses don't make much money. And in terms of insecurity, they also face insecurity with the increasing corporatisation of goods and services in this country. And that's why we've actually seen a fall in the number of people involved in the small business sector. So in 2025, insecurity is linked to finances, is linked to wages. The difference between 1970 and 2025 is that in 1970, one wage earner in a household could earn enough money to meet the day-to-day costs of that household. In 2025, with the privatisation of the housing sector, what we've seen is an extraordinary rise in rents and housing prices. So we now face a ridiculous situation where 2 people in a household need to be working full-time to pay those necessary bills that we all, have to look at and have to pay at the end of the day. So what we are seeing is an increase in insecurity. Not the insecurity brought out by war or the insecurity brought on by a lack of resources, but an insecurity which has been manufactured to a significant degree, like the climate emergency, through the domination of our economic system by a private investment for private profit mantra. As I said before, unless 2 people in a household are working full-time, the chances of meeting your financial responsibilities and commitments are almost non-existent. So there's interesting statistics that came out of the ABA, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, recently. The fact is that a decreasing number of Australians are changing jobs. Although they may be able to access increased wages, they decide not to change jobs because the dilemma they face is that insecurity which occurs when you're on an individual contract. And moving from one individual contract to another is very dangerous, because at any time that contract can be terminated. And at the same time, we have legislation in place which allows businesses, even hairdressers, to actually prevent you from taking up that same profession in a particular radius from your previous employer. So we have all these mechanisms in place which increase insecurity. Now, to a significant degree, many of the psychological problems we see in our country today, including increased anxiety and reactive depression related to the situation you find yourself in, can be directly related to insecurity, financial insecurity. Now, financial insecurity then spills over into personal relationships, the interaction between people in the same household who are faced with the dilemma of paying those never-ending bills that you're faced with every day. So fear does stalk the land. Not the fear of being killed, not the fear of being assaulted, but the fear of losing everything because you are no longer in a position to be part of the wage system. You are no longer in a position to be part of successful small business. So there is this all-pervasive fear. Now, this fear has ramifications which go beyond people's inability to meet their financial commitments. It has a profound impact on society. What it does is it increases conservatism and conservative values in the community. It increases a yes sir mentality where any disagreement becomes an issue, especially if that disagreement leads to the termination of your employment. Because today, in 2025, when only 12% of the population is involved in trade unions, when legislation has been passed which makes striking outside an illegal, outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period illegal, we have no protection for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of the power of their employer. People talk about the Fair Work Commission, but to get your case heard in the Fair Work Commission takes time. Time people don't have when they face unemployment. And then that fear that stalks the community is also based on the fact that in 2025, almost every aspect of your life can be followed on social media, which means that employers have a significant opportunity to regulate their employees' interests, especially political, social and cultural interests. So we create a fear in the community that forces the majority of people to work up the right channels. What that means is to obey the law, to pay their taxes, to acquiesce, to doff their cap at their masters. A little bit like 18th century Europe. Now, I know this may sound a little bit facetious, But the fact is, the lack of significant action, whether it's social action, political action, cultural action in this country, is integrated with this fear that if you don't act in the right way, your ability to earn an income in your chosen field is terminated. And it gets worse. With corporatisation, the ability of the individual to move from job to job to job is strictly limited. So if you become involved in a dispute with your employer, the fact is that your ability to obtain employment in that same field is greatly diminished. And that's the dilemma. We don't need to ban people anymore because we find ourselves in a situation where banning people from being involved in certain activities and employment opportunities is an integral component of the workplace culture today. The matter is complicated with the introduction of artificial intelligence in terms of employing people, in terms of assessing initially whether they should receive an interview. So there is this fear, and it's a real fear, and it's a well-founded fear. And this fear is what prevents people from pursuing that struggle for a more egalitarian community where the interests of the public, that's the many, are put before the interests of the few. So fear does stalk the land, but it's a fear which is invisible. It's a fear which creates anxiety. It's a fear that can't be defined, but it's everywhere, and it's based on increasing insecurity. And it's related to a large degree to the fact that in Australia we are governed by a constitution which has no values, no rights, no aspirations. A document that doesn't protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. So what we are seeing is the creation of a more authoritarian community, not just in terms of the laws which are passed to inhibit and prevent demonstrations and opposition to mainstream society, but a fear which prevents people from taking action, not only to improve their situation, but to improve the situation of society as a whole. So no longer do we have movements like in the 1970s, which forced Parliament to make fundamental changes in society. What we have is incremental change, which is so slow that even a snail outpaces that change. Incremental change that doesn't come from below, but incremental change which comes from governments at the local, state and federal level as they negotiate with ever-increasing powerful corporations about the amount of crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table in your direction. No longer are the interests of the many put the interests before the interests of the few, because the many have been cowed. The many have been pushed down. The many now believe that change is impossible. They think that the cost of being involved in activities which promote reform and radical change are not worth it, because that cost is directly interlinked to their ability to make enough money to pay their necessities. And that's the dilemma we have in 2025. We have a cowed population, a population that through fear is no longer willing to act collectively, to act together, to force governments to introduce parliamentary change. And that's why we have the same problems decade in and decade out, and that's why even the changes of government seem to have a minuscule attempt, changes that make minuscule attempts to resolve those issues. How can a population of 26 million people living on a resource-rich continent continue to count, child poverty? 2 million children living in poverty. How can we have a society where there are over 35,000 charities working to raise money to deal with issues that should have been dealt with ages ago, decades ago, eons ago by governments? Why do we see the same stories over and over again? Why have governments abrogated their responsibility to represent the interests of the many? And to a significant degree, it's because of this climate of fear that is now part and parcel of everyday life. And to a significant degree, that fear is creating increasing anxiety at both the personal and community level. At no time in Australian history has there been so many people paralysed by anxiety, so many people seeking psychological assistance to deal with everyday life. And this happens when people believe that change is impossible. It happens when fear, the fear of not meeting your commitments, dominates your decision-making processes in terms of where you live, who you work for, how you work, the type of work you're involved in, the relationships you're involved in. Fear stalks the land. And to overcome this fear, we need to be able to create a society which is not based solely on a wage system, but a society based on a universal basic income, where people are not held hostage by the system of government we now hold. They're not held hostage, but have the ability to make decisions regarding their lives. What seems impossible in 2025 will not be impossible in 2050, because the history of humanity is a history of progress, but that progress has to be initiated and promoted by the many. And that's why I encourage you to join public interests before corporate interests, because we put the future of the many before the future of the few.